Okay, and this week's podcast episode is how to build a governance framework for generative AI. And I'm thrilled to introduce Jason Pikoos, Managing Partner, Client Experience at Connor Group, where he is responsible for providing world-class client services and driving technology and innovation. In this role, he spearheads automation and AI software-powered solutions for accounting and finance. Jason is also one of the AI thought leaders at Connor, as they've introduced the first ever enterprise risk framework for generative AI, which provides a detailed guide to help companies of all sizes move into responsible Gen AI adoption. Built in collaboration with over 1,000 business leaders, academics, and industry bodies, the Gen AI governance framework is a customizable new tool enabling organizations to safely adopt Gen AI while seamlessly integrating with their enterprise risk management program, unique objectives, and risk tolerance. Jason, I'm so thrilled to have you here, man. This is, oh my God, this is such an important point. We talk a lot about generative AI and the hype and curves and all that kind of stuff, and very little about governance. So to be the pioneer in instituting a framework is fantastic. More power to you, man. This is great. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, well, thanks for the invite. Happy to share our thoughts and our perspectives on it. I agree. I think there is a lot of hype. I mean, definitely in the hype cycle with AI, and everybody's so excited about the technology. We just need to make sure that it's not about not adopting. And you'll hear that I'm a big AI proponent, but it's adopting responsibly, right? And responsibility is a big word, but I think that's why we ultimately develop the framework so that people can think about all the exciting stuff, but also make sure we do it in a fashion that doesn't damage either us individually or the organizations that are using it.
Thank you, Jason. And I can tell you, Jason, having met you several weeks ago, it's fairly new. What was most impressive was the simplicity of the framework. I've come across a few. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm very curious about kind of board perspective, so it's typically 1,000 feet. But I can tell you, having looked at some frameworks and the density of questions and all this stuff, I'm lost. I'm completely lost. So the fact that you've really brought it down to something fairly simple is fantastic. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it was a big part of making sure that it actually gets used, right? When you give somebody, 60-page essay with thousands of questions to answer, it's just that you don't know where to start. So even part of it, to be honest, was part of it, hey, we need to get a good visual. Sometimes it's just about the data. It's not. The visual is also important so people can get their minds around, there are multiple components, they're interconnected. Some of them sit on top of the other. So it's just, yeah, you're right. I mean, it took us some time to get the thought right, but I appreciate that. I'm happy that you kind of find it simple and easy to kind of get one's head around.
Lovely. Okay, so let's start by framing the 5 essential domains, Jason. So what are these?
So there are 5 core domains within the framework, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase them because I probably don't remember them perfectly, but one of them is about strategy and in the environment, or the control environment, which is really around making sure that generative AI is deployed in line with corporate strategy and direction. And the second component is, hey, make sure that you have the right type of environment, whether it's policies or tone at the top. The other one is really around operational components of generative. It's in the environment. You need to manage its operations, which means how do I have good controls around the outcomes and what it's generating, but also ongoing maintenance of these systems, change management, access to these systems. The third component is around data and regulations. And that's really around what is happening to your data? What data are you putting in there? What happens to it when it goes into the AI? It's a unique methodology of technology where historically technology is sitting on your servers, it's sitting in some sort of SaaS server that's dedicated to you. Now we're seeing a piece of technology where you're putting data into it and it's going to another third party, sometimes multiple third parties. So what's happening to your data? How does it get there? How are you comfortable that it's being used? Is it being stored? Are the systems being trained on it? And then the other component there in that one is around regulatory. I mean, it's a fast evolving regulatory environment. There are already a lot of existing regulations that affect you in the AI space. I think that's why people are like, well, there's no regulations because the US hasn't passed anything. Oh, no, there are regulations in the US impacted by AI. So being aware of those and getting ahead of those. Another one is around transparency and accountability. I think the challenges with some of these models, especially whether you're using the models directly or whether you're using a piece of software that is leveraging these models, we don't know. It's a black box. We don't know what it's using, how it's using, where it's referencing the results. So how do you get comfortable with a piece of technology that transparency is limited. We've actually used the word black box for technology before, but that's actually not really true. Older kind of pre-AI technology, you really could see the exact configuration, and it may be complicated, and thus the black box comment, but it's actually was truly visual. You could see how it was set up and how that ties to the outcomes. But with generative AI, there really is a black box. There is no easy, you can ask it to explain, but what it is doing again is another black box explaining its kind of logic, but it's not exactly what it did. And then the last piece, when it is an important part, and I think that gets forgotten a lot, and in all honesty, some of the discussion we've had to date with some companies around the governance framework shows that this is a really neglected area, but it's about the people, the ethics, the bias, as well as the environmental impacts. This AI chews up a huge amount of energy. It is going to impact our people, and it has this unusual form of risk that we've never had to deal with before, which is ethics and bias.
Yep.
Right? I mean, ethics and bias are very important things, but they typically haven't been something that our technology is causing. It's something that our humans using the technology is causing. And now you have a technology that, if depending on its circumstances, can create bias in the outcome. So those are the 5 components of it. Under each one of those, well, there are 5 domains, 13 core risks under these 5 domains, and about 70 control considerations under those risks to help companies guide them through this process.
Let's we're going to unpack each of those areas in more detail. Jason, where can the audience, the listeners, get the framework?
Oh, great. Yeah.
Let's say that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. We do have a landing page.
Yes.
Like maybe we can share that at the end of the session, or we
Yes.
can out to your listeners. So there's a landing page. You can click on it. It's free. It's also not one of those links where you have to click on and give your entire family history and all your contact details and cell phone number and social, and all. You literally click on it, it downloads. There are also a couple of posts if you want to. You can go look at my LinkedIn account. It's also available there if that's a little easier. So there's a few different places where you can go get it. And once again, it's 100% free.
So Jason's making the ultimate promise here. You know, if you call now for 1999,
but that's not all.
Good to know, Jason. Okay, so by using the framework, what should organizations expect to achieve?
It's a great question. The reality is we're seeing this as a gradual adoption. The intent of the framework is not to, and it's funny, we've had this question, well, should we measure ourselves against the framework? Why should we bother? Because we're going to be terrible. The intent of measurement is that you set a baseline and then you can monitor improvement. And that really is the intent of the framework. It's a lot of considerations, but that companies really should be striving to address the major concerns and do it gradually over time. But you also just need to be focused on what really matters. I think it's not a boil the ocean exercise. There's a lot in the framework, even though it's quite simple. It's also quite deep. Really focus on, we actually are breaking it down now into really, hey, if you look at your commercial side of your business, in other words, how do you interact with your customers? What type of risks does generative AI expose in that space? And where are you from an adoption standpoint? And then from an internal operations, what are your risks? And how fast have you started adopting? When you kind of look at those dimensions, you start seeing, okay, hey, if my business, my customers are highly exposed if I use generative AI and I'm already rapidly adopting, you better get onto this framework very, very quickly because of the fact that you're exposing yourself significantly. On the other hand, we actually just spoke to a client where the reality is generative AI in their product has very limited risks. Not no risks, but limited risks. And their adoption is super, super slow. Well, in that case, let's not overstress this. Let's start on the journey, start getting some of the basic blocking and tackling in place, and then build up over time as you progress into the kind of the adoption of generative AI. So it's really intended to be something that you progress into. So.
Got it. Wonderful. Okay. Broad strokes. 4 steps, bit of change management is what I noticed. So how should organizations use the framework? Just in 4 simple steps, the process, and then we're going to kind of go into each of the domains.
Yeah, I mean, we've always want people to start off with some degree of scoping and planning, right? Once again, and when you think of scoping and planning, it's not just which of the domains. So there's 5 different domains. You should be probably asking yourself, which ones are the ones that are most critical? That's how we start. We ask people, what do you think the likelihood is? And what do you think the impact is for each of these domains underneath it? Where should you be focusing, right? But you should also be looking at scope from a functional standpoint. Maybe there's a technology bent. Is it more on the commercial side or more on the internal operations? So start with your scoping. Figure out where you're going to focus your time and attention. Don't boil the ocean. right? Then engage the right group of people. I think that's a really important, folks. This is not a finance and accounting problem. This is an organizational wide challenge. So engage the right people. At a minimum, we are suggesting internal audit, especially if you're a public organization, legal, because there's a lot of legal ramifications here, and either IT or security. Those sometimes IT and security are separate, sometimes they're together. Those are the three key ones. Then other stakeholders could be the CFO, or certainly could be folks on the sales side, the marketing side, depending on how you're using it. So it's scoping, then engage the right folks. Then it's about really just doing some discovery of where things are, what are people doing. And that's your typical things with interviews, walkthroughs, systems analyses. And then it's a matter of then coming back and looking at, okay, based on my scope, the people that are involved, what I heard, how does this benchmark against the more risky areas of the framework for me? And what do I do from there, right? And it's about finding practical, short-term, small steps to progress through this. This is not, once again, about boiling the ocean or making complex, jumping the gun. Just let's start progressively moving. So those are the 4 steps.
Wonderful. Great. All right. So we're going to dive in now, right? So
Yep.
the first domain, strategic alignment and the control environment, as you mentioned that, right? So how can businesses ensure that their Gen AI initiatives are strategically aligned with their overall business goals and values?
That's a great question. I think we put that in there, but in the irony of it is when I answer those, I think about this question, it's, hey, don't think about generative AI to begin with, start with your strategy. I think the biggest mistake, and I keep hearing it over and over, and I have a lot of these AI conversations because everybody says, oh, the board is asking, what are we doing about generative AI? And I think that point of view starts the problem of misalignment because it presumes an outcome that it's generative AI. I think what the ultimate best way to do it is, what are your business goals? What are you trying to achieve as an organization? How does technology support those goals? Which is the best technology to use to support those goals? And if it is generative AI, fantastic, then line it up. I think that is one of the most important things about this. It's recognize that generative AI is a tool, but it's one tool in a broad tool belt. And therefore, that focus on business objectives, strategic goals, and then oftentimes those kind of break down. Making sure that there's good alignment between the use of the technology and actual business goals is just the best way to make sure that we just don't find ourselves in the world of adopting AI because everybody else is doing it. Do not be caught up in the FOMO, right? So
I love that, Jason. And as I've researched the topic a bit more, I think you hit it on the nail because we're thinking that this is this separate kind of little entity on the side, etc. It's not. It's part of your entire kind of strategic plan, so to speak, and also part of your ERM strategy, right? It's not separate and independent of that. So excellent point. Okay. So what role does the control environment play in managing the risks associated with Gen AI technologies?
It's a great point. I mean, ultimately, the control environment is where all your governance and controls operate, generically speaking. And when we think about the control environment, there's obviously the policies component you need to establish. And funny enough, that's, I think, the one thing we've seen most organizations have done. I don't know if they went to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT, and that's how they deployed it so quickly, but there are policies out there. Most organizations that we at least speak to tend to have them. I will say that they're a little overly simplistic. They don't necessarily address all the unique risks associated with generative AI, but at least there is something there. So it's about really the environment is let's get some broad policies so that people have the rules of the road to operate within. But another big part of that control environment is tone at the top. We have one example with another customer that we worked through and kind of went through the governance. We did an assessment of them against the governance framework. And what was really nice to know was, and we heard this loud and clear at the beginning, is, hey, 2 years ago, they've been doing this for a while, even in the machine learning space before the hype on generative AI. And their CEO recognized that there are risks and implications to using this technology for their customers and their people. Recognize it's a super important thing because that trust for their customers and people is super important, and started adoption 2 years ago. And that is amazing when the CEO is standing there and saying, this, guys, is both a strategic technology that needs to be done responsibly. We're not about getting it there quickly, we're about getting it there, doing it well. It is amazing how that attitude permeates all the way down. So every person that we spoke to, all the way to the most junior person that we engaged with, was AI is important. That was a given. Now it was a question of what are we doing about it? And that, to me, I think is a piece where, like with many other types of controls, if you don't have that right tone at the top, I think we will find that either it's done as a lip service or ignored altogether.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. So can you share some best practices for establishing effective governance structures that balance innovation and control when deploying Gen AI?
Yeah, that's a big question. One of the things I've really enjoyed with what I've seen most companies do is kind of get some sort of AI committee together. Um, Admittedly, there's also a little bit unclear exactly what their roles are. Sometimes they're kind of more operational, sometimes they're executive, sometimes there's a bit of a confusion in the middle. But just bringing people together to talk about generative AI, one allows us to view what other organizations or functions are doing, because there's actually a lot of overlap with typically with technology, there's a lot of multi-use cases. So one that brings everybody together to see what are you doing, what are you planning. It allows for a shared point of view on it. It also creates that environment of dialogue. Okay, if the legal team is there and the internal audit team is there and the sales team is there, or marketing, and marketing wants to deploy some sort of fancy, lovely AI, there's the opportunity for these folks to have a discussion about it in a fairly real-time fashion. So to me, I think that's one of the big things to kind of create that. I do think one of the other things that's super helpful is really starting to engage people early and starting to get people into that mindset of this is an evolutionary technology. It is going to not only change what we do, but it's going to continuously change what we do. So if we want to be adaptive, if we want to be flexible, we need to, one, engage people early, but also start getting people's mindset around the fact that we are in a ongoing innovation cycle here.
Yeah.
And we are no longer probably in the world of kind of set it and forget it. I'm going to implement my ERP and I'm not going to worry about it for the next 10, 15 years. In many respects, those times are gone. So, right, start engaging with your people, establishing that kind of regular change environment, while also kind of creating a forum where you can share ideas and share best practices, as well as make sure that you're adopting thoughtfully real time. I think there's some really good ways to create some of that structure that will allow you to both be moving fast, moving responsibly, but do also in a kind of an innovative fashion.
Got it. Jason, it's a new world.
Mhm.
You mentioned a committee, which is typically the place to start.
Yep.
Who should be on that committee in a typical kind of corporate hierarchy, corporate organization?
Yeah,
Who should be on that committee?
yeah, it's a great question. And we've seen a bit of a couple of flavors. So we've seen more of an operating committee versus a more of a strategic version of it, where the
Yeah.
strategic version has your kind of your C-level individuals or that exec level group. And then there's an operating committee, which are maybe one or two steps below that. Personally, I think the operating structure might be a better one to start with. We want our executives to set the plans and the goals, but we don't necessarily, admittedly, necessarily the CFO or the CEO in the weeds of how we do it. So we don't want to disconnect those. And what we want is the board or the executive committee or whatever it might be, set the goals, set the strategy, set the plans, set the financial results, whatever it is. Let this operating committee then, one, be responsible for translating those, which they typically do anyway, into operational goals, and then tie those into AI. Enforce that requirement. But then that operating committee is the one that is much more on the front line. And that's the reason why I like it, because they are the ones that are actually seeing the technology being used, or actually seeing the opportunities, or actually seeing how one use by one group can cause risks and problems by another group. So the operating committee is the one that I like. Groups to involve IT, legal, finance. Depending on how complex your HR environment, certainly HR can have a role in the table. And their actually role would be twofold. One would be the people side of it, one would be obviously their functional side. And then sales and marketing are probably good teams. If you're a software or there's a development team, obviously those guys probably also deserve a seat in the table. So it's almost kind of a key representative for most functions in these committees.
Okay, and let's step it up in terms of the org structure. Who does or where does governance report to ultimately? One spot. Where do you think that lies?
Oh, great question. I am a big fan of it rolling up ultimately to the CFO. Not to say that a GC can't do it. I think just the world and the perspective of the GC tends to be somewhat narrow. I think the IT side of the house has governance responsibilities, but again, their role is almost infrastructure oriented and therefore not necessarily business results. So I've always liked the CFO as the owner of governance across the organization ultimately. because one, they have a very big view of the organization. Their focus is not only controls, although they tend to be controls bent. Finance and accounting people just tend to be oriented towards more controls. But at the same token, one eye is also maintained on the prize and where are we trying to go. So it feels like a really, the CFO always has felt like a good place for me where, hey, we've been thoughtful about this financially, we're being prudent about this, we care about controls and compliance, and then working with GCs and IT organization to make sure we have the right. But ultimately, I'm a big fan of the CFO owning at least this framework.
And so I'm gonna veer off a little bit, Jason, because you're in the world of advisory and so
Yeah.
on. What have you seen from an audit standpoint? Has kind of generative AI governance and risk analysis, has that kind of flowed into the world of external audits yet? Or
I think that what I'm observing is it feels like what they're trying to do is a bit of a water off a duck's back. I think that's what they would like, meaning let's just all the AI stuff flow around the world of audits and let's do so we can ignore it. So what we've seen to date this year is not necessarily a blind eye, because obviously external auditors are not blind to it, but I guess a hope and a pray or a expectation that there's very little reliance on generative AI. And we've seen those actually certain actually probably it exists in probably most big four at least management rep letters, a comment around the use of generative AI, and there's very reliance or zero reliance on it. So at this stage, I think it's much more a matter of, hey, we're just handing off this risk. There is no risk here. Don't look behind the curtain. Everything is fine. I think what we will see, and that is okay, because also adoption in finance and accounting has been somewhat limited to date, focused, narrow, or not used at all. I think what we will see is next year, there's going to be a lot more adoption in finance and accounting. There's no doubt. I mean, they're going to use it more. They're going to see it more. It's going to put a lot more pressure on the external audit teams to come up with, okay, well, if they are using a generative AI tool to do analytics or review revenue contracts or do help with my order management process or record my AP invoices or do disclosures or whatever it might be that you're doing, I think the auditors are going to have to start asking some tough questions. I think what they're most likely will lean on next year is a very heavy human reliance methodology. What that looks like is a really good question. It's actually something I'm hoping we'll write some. I want to put a proposal out there, because right now I think there are effective ways you can put controls around generative AI. It's not simple and straightforward. So we're going to put hopefully before the end of the year, we'll put our thought of, hey, this is how you define and do a good controls around it. But to be honest, I think that right now the audit firms don't actually know what they exactly want to do. I would imagine there's some very, very heavy discussions going on, but there's also been no guidance from the PCAOB, who has regularly beaten up on the big four. So I think it's like a bit of well, our clients are not using it, so we don't have to worry about it. And the PCAOB hasn't given us guidance, so we don't really know what to do about it. So I think we're having next year's audits will be super interesting, to be honest. So
I'm looking forward to that. Okay, domain two, domain two, data and compliance management. So data is the backbone of generative AI.
yes.
How can organizations ensure compliance with data privacy and security regulations when using AI models?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first and foremost, actually, one of the things that you need, well, not all data is created equal, right? So most organizations don't do this, but you really should, especially when you're working through and want to use generative AI, is really classify your data. What type of data and its risk and its sensitivity, right? So when you bucket that, it allows you to then recognize that, okay, I'm going to put generative AI on top of my employee data or top of my customer data, which maybe there's a lot of confidential info. Those are probably high risk, but there's probably many aspects of our organization which are very, very low risk from a data standpoint. So one is, it's important to just classify that, because that gets you on the right starting point as you then look at the adoption of AI. Presuming that you move forward with AI, it's super, super important. I think this is one of those areas where there are gaps, is you need to invest the time understanding how data is being used in the model. So what data is going to be ingested? How is it ingested? How is it transferred? How is it stored? Does the technology retain your data or delete the data? Does it train on the data? Does it not? These are a big series of questions that you really need to understand very clearly, because I think a lot of people will just assume that, hey, it's fine, it's a piece of technology, it must be secure. And you really need to ask these questions thoroughly. The reality is that there are also no standards right now from these, especially the AI models, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or Google or even Meta. They don't have, there's no framework that governs how they're supposed to use data. There's no method to test what they're doing with it. So you are still relying on contractual behavior. It's super important to at least ask those questions and get corroboration. If you're using a middle piece of software, and we work with a lot of software that kind of use the generative AI in the background, you need to make sure that they have a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 report. Ideally, if we're talking data, it's primarily a SOC 2 type 2 report. Nice if they have the ISO certifications, and you can ask a variety of other questions around how they store the data, because they oftentimes in the middle, they can also be storing your data and training their own models or training OpenAI models on your data. So those questions are relevant both for what's happening with the underlying AI model, right? ChatGPT, Llama, Gemini, but also for the technology provider that is using one or many of these, what are they doing with your data? It's a really, really big question that that I don't know if most companies are asking it to a sufficient level of detail.
Understood. Right. Okay. All right. What processes should companies implement to manage the risk of data bias or ethical misuse in GenAI? You kicked it off at the beginning, and so that leads nicely into this question.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a really tricky one because it's
Yes.
actually quite difficult because of the fact that we often don't know what the bias is going to be.
Yes.
It's a good exercise of the starting point is you almost have to sit back and kind of for a second stop thinking about the AI and just cast your imagination out there about how might bias creep into my world. Forget the AI and exactly what it is, but how might it creep in there? Because it is exposing us in ways that we would never have thought before. I think one of the companies that we did the evaluation with, their tool would recommend certain tasks or actions to individuals. And this was a really good example of an engineer like thinking through this a little bit further and asking themselves, well, what happens if the AI is so used to most of the time seeing Anglo-Saxon named individuals getting these tasks and infers that it's not the role or the department or the level or the country, but what's driving it is the name, will it start only recommending it to other Anglo-Saxon named individuals? It's like, I've never thought of that, but that is certainly one of those things. And it's not to suggest that the AI did that at all, but that awareness of it then allows you to take the next step, which is one is checking the model. Does the model allow you? Does it give you parameters to adjust or manage or vet or double check itself? So AI is not very good at recognizing it's making mistakes or being biased, but it's typically very good at evaluating itself. So are there ways where you can kind of create what's oftentimes referred to maybe as an agentic flow that can respond and then the next agent can double check and look for these type of bias, and can you architect those? But the other thing it allows you to do is when you're deploying the AI to deliberately test for that specific concern to make sure that it isn't happening. So it's a bit of an act of an imagination at the beginning to think about things that we probably haven't thought about before. What capabilities sit within the technology to allow you to address the risk? And some of them do and some of them don't. And if they don't, how are you testing both at deployment and on an ongoing basis to make sure that that bias that may not be there at day one, but may actually come in later because the models are changing? How do you test on an ongoing basis to make sure that bias or ethical, I guess, challenges don't creep in? So.
Have you seen anything that crosses the ethical boundaries? As an example, this is a mind-blowing conversation, by the way, Jason. My wheels are turning. I'm trying to think. Oh my God, there's a lot left to the imagination at this point,
Yeah.
because we don't have the answers. But what's a scenario that could cross ethical boundaries?
I don't know if this is necessarily the perfect scenario, but what we are seeing is the use of AI in fraud right now. It's unbelievable what you can do with it. I think one of the university professors that actually helped was a co-author of the governance framework, David Wood, did one of these, and he pretended to be the CEO of Apple. And he recorded himself normally and then used generative AI to basically create the image over him, and it looks exactly like the Apple CEO. There was also just an example, we're actually going to do a post on LinkedIn later today about it, but of a fraud where basically the person jumped on a Zoom call or something along those lines, and there's the CFO with a few other people in the room, and it was totally fake, and the person transferred $25 million. So, that's some of the, that's the extreme of lack of ethical use. Other ones, I mean, I've heard this come up. I think it's more of a serious consideration for organizations in the marketing space, which is, we love to use images. I've used some of those AI generated images and generated AI content. Are our marketing departments publishing amazing content that is actually based on other people's hard work, right? They took the photos, they generate the content. Is it effectively, are we inadvertently stealing from people? That's probably one of the most common ones that are out there. It does feel on the other end that in some respects, at least from a historical standpoint, that ship has sailed because of the fact that I don't know if we can pull that info out of these models anymore because they've trained on it. But what protections? I think it'd be nice to see if we can do some protections going forward, because I do worry it's like we want people to be innovative, whether it's in photography or writing or whatever it is. And if their stuff is just going to get stolen, we do risk the kind of the loss of creativity, I guess.
Absolutely. Jason, there is a very flourishing kind of ecosystem here in South Florida where you got the young techs. They're coming
Mm-hmm.
out of schools and colleges, and they're particularly focused on the AI world. So I did hear about that Zoom
Yeah.
call,
Yeah.
fake CFO and transferring
Crazy.
money. And yeah, one of them I heard, I've yet to follow up with him. This is a couple of months ago, but he was developing a system which was scour,
Mm.
systems for that type of kind of fake activity,
Right.
and
Yeah, which
things.
is
So
it's going to be that, we used to have that with normal kind of IT access, and
yes.
somebody does something and then the security companies figure it out and we have this cat and mouse, and now we're going to get a whole new cat and mouse. But what it's telling me is that organizations need to go back very quickly and look at least, especially those high risk, like your cash payments right
Yes,
now. I
yes,
would go double down on those,
yes.
because nobody should be allowed to make any transfer without a corroborated second person. It can't be, I'm the CFO, he's right there, or she's right there, it's okay for me to approve it. Nope. You need to have a corroborated one where you have a secure channel of communication with them. You do the outreach, because man, oh man, the fraud that you can commit with this, and it was difficult to spot these things before. And with AI, I mean, my goodness, I was actually picturing myself if my CEO was on the line and he's asking me for a question. The probability is I would have. And we all look at those people. How did they do that? The reality is that person is a really smart individual who's probably quite thoughtful and quite aware of fraud and fell for it, because that's how good this technology is.
And it's a very common fall, I tell you.
Yeah.
No, you're 100% right without going into the details. I've seen too many of those instances. Okay, operational and technology management. When it comes to operationalizing Gen AI, what are some common technological risks businesses need to be aware of?
Yeah, to me, the number one here is the accuracy risk, which is I'm using it in my business operations. What's the effect? Or what happens if it's wrong? So to me, that's the question when it comes under SOX controls. This is kind of oftentimes that it sits here. What are those business process controls, whether it's financial reporting, or it could be even outside of it, right? For marketing, for sales, right? If this thing is recommending discounts, or it's acting as a reviewer of pricing or whatever it is, how do I know that I'm not giving away the farm or getting it totally wrong or whatever it might be? So that is a really major risk that I see in that space. The other one is just the ongoing management of changes within this technology. And what does that look like? How do you maintain and sustain change management as well as just ongoing user access? It's really a curious model. There was another one, a case, I forget what, might have been Samsung actually. They deployed, I think it was maybe Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT, I forget which piece of technology they deployed in the organization, not fully appreciating that how they deployed it suddenly opened access of certain types of data to people that should not see it, right? These are not your traditional access models where you put it in the data and then, you can go through and you can check the box of who sees what, and it's very, very clear. You have to be much more thoughtful about, if you're basically letting the AI access your data, how are you restricting that and how are you managing it? So those are some of the risks which we see as like the change management. It's that, how do I maintain appropriate user access from a day in and day out standpoint? They can only do what they're supposed to do. They can only see what they're supposed to see. And then, how do I get comfortable around it? The accuracy of outputs. And that is not always, in some cases, frankly, we don't care. It's like, hey, it's good enough, just looks pretty, get it out there. Finance and accounting folks, man, oh man, if my disclosure is wrong or my rev rec is wrong, that's a problem, right? So that to me, I think is a really big component.
Absolutely. And Jason, make the distinction because in the framework, it had mentioned there's a typical, generative AI, chat GBT,
Yeah.
Copilot. There's one set of kind of change management rules around that. But you also mentioned company
Mhm.
GPT. Just make the distinction between the two because these are two things that companies should be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the AI deployed in a lot of different ways, actually. Obviously, you've got just your normal chatbots, which you described, and even those now can be customized. You can create your custom GBTs, but ultimately, it's still a very, it's a kind of individual one-on-one engagement. We are seeing companies now build technology around these GBT models. Or and they may access one or many of the models to do it, and they may build a whole set of software that then allow it, either the AI is being used in the background and maybe not be visible to the user, or it may be directly visible. So, for example, I might create a database with information. I might put a GBT or a chat model on top to be able to interact with that data. But other ones are ones where it's just reading documents and extracting information. So I may not be accessing it directly. But there is also the scenario of third parties companies. We work with quite a few of them where they're saying, hey, we got a very clear use case here, and we know that there's a use case in finance and accounting because that's typically where we tend to focus, but there are ones obviously that are outside of that. And they're building some software, and so there is major components of traditional software capabilities, workflows, forms, checklists, access, all that kind of stuff. But that is paired with these AI models. Again, users may not necessarily be chatting with the model, but their technology might be extracting. They've said, for example, they may be able to create predefined data extractors. So all the users saying, hey, I want the system to extract these pieces of information. And then the system is actually directly taking the data, interacting with the model. So you got a lot of flavors of it. And that makes it really tricky as you're deploying governance is, well, what do I do for each one of them? And especially when the generative AI component is combined with a piece of software, what's actual traditional software versus what's generative AI is not actually an easy question, because sometimes it's clear, hey, who has access, and the access role may be certainly clear, but then there are pieces of it that are not necessarily clear. I might have a workflow that is derived from what the generative AI pulled out. So is that software? Is that generative AI? Is it a mix of both? So those are what we're seeing as kind of these different flavors of technology. And I think people just need to be aware of those as they deploy AI. So.
Wonderful. Okay. Next domain, human, ethical, and social considerations. This is a key part.
Mhm.
All right. You mentioned that up front. So, what are some of the ethical challenges businesses face when implementing Gen AI, and how can these challenges be addressed in governance frameworks?
That's a great one. And I think, some of the ethical ones are obviously the use of data and whose data
Yep.
are we using. It's really interesting to see if you kind of go, a lot of license agreements now have kind of been adjusted, even stuff that's available publicly. They're like, hey, you can't use this in AI. So I think that's probably one of them it's that whether it's copyright or IP infringement. I think that is a really big one that is very difficult to manage in this current environment. So I think probably the best mechanism to deal with that from a governance standpoint is ask ourselves, as we look to use generative AI in this space, is there a risk of us stealing other people's IP? Or secondarily, asking the technology provider, in other words, whether it's OpenAI, is what data sources are you using? Or can I restrict the data? So there are ways, there's a thing called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. So when you tell the AI to respond by only looking at a specific data set. So what you could do if you're concerned about IP infringement, for example, for marketing, you don't want to steal other people's ideas. What you could do is maybe you have your own database of historical marketing materials. Maybe there are databases of either pictures or text that you can acquire, and then you can deploy an AI using this RAG methodology to contain the responses. So it'll only ever respond by looking at data that is something that you either paid for or it's already yours. So that's one of those. There is obviously inappropriate use of technology. I was speaking to a person that works for one of the large ERP companies, and this person is responsible for deployment of their generative AI governance. And one of the biggest questions was, and the challenges that this person was confronted with, we could think of all the tools and different controls around it. What we can't control is how the humans use it. Because if it's buried in the background and you're not directly interacting with the model, it's just doing specific tasks, it's quite controlled. But if we're actually giving people some sort of chat bot capability or ability to interact with these tools that you can customize in many different ways, I can't control what the human does. And man, oh man, people are super innovative. So that is another one is how do we know that they are doing things that they're supposed to be doing, right? How do we know that they are, appropriate business use, not using it for inappropriate use? Um, that those are some of the ones which is a really interesting question. We deployed a chat bot to our entire firm. We do have some monitoring on the background to see type of the queries and some of the prompts that people run, but that is one of those ways where you probably need to be thinking about the inappropriate use of these technologies. Are people getting to data they shouldn't? Are they asking questions they shouldn't? Or are they frankly just using it for personal matter, which is not really appropriate? So there's a lot of those type of things. Obviously, there's the other extremes, where you're getting inappropriate content, or erroneous content because of the fact that you're kind of accessing data sets that are erroneous. So, but this is a really good, the ethics one, it's one that I think will be interesting to see as it evolves over time. I think one of the other ethical ones is, which was just the same person that was concerned about people using it. The example that they gave was, these are really challenging because many accuracy is oftentimes a binary question. It's either right or it's wrong. Ethics is often a judgmental area. And there are some rules around ethics, but if you try and embed them in your technology, at what point in time are you starting to insert yourself into moral questions,
Yeah.
right? And morality is not necessarily something that we look as the purview of the CFO when it comes on to governance. So that's the really interesting one. What is true ethics versus morality? And I don't want to get into a very philosophical debate, but that they were like, they started building all these rules around ethics. And then they were like, but is this ethics? Is this morality? And ultimately, like, we're going to put this one aside for now because we're not 100% sure how to exactly address it. So really, really interesting. And this is the kind of stuff that you just don't talk about for technology. Which technology laws do you say, oh, is it giving me a morally appropriate answer? It's like,
We've added another dimension. You're 100%
so,
right, Jason. I
yeah,
mean, we've typically thought of in the corporate world, there's a legal and there's an ethical piece,
yeah,
right? What must you do? What should you do? But now there is a morality piece. Right? There's a third dimension. It's getting very complicated.
seriously very
Jason.
complicated.
And then I wanted to, we won't unpack it now if we get time a bit later, but it sounds like a circular motion as you just kind of mentioned that, because ultimately, there's got to be some human oversight somewhere.
Mm.
You mentioned at the end there's some check and balances,
Yeah,
probably some kind of human doing that. I'm wondering how it all plays out, but I want to come back to that point. Let's keep going with some of these other considerations. So, how can businesses make sure that their Gen AI initiatives positively
yeah,
impact employees, customers, and society as a whole?
yeah. That's a big question. There's a lot there. Certainly if you start just from the people standpoint, I do think one of the things that needs to be done is early engagement, right? Get the team, get the people, the organization at large involved early. Because I think nothing is more scary to us as individuals as the unknown, especially when the unknown is occurring behind closed doors. The flip side of that is actually there's a huge amount of opportunity because oftentimes those people at the grassroots level can find really exciting use cases for generative AI that we probably would not think about, at the board level, I guess. So one is doing that. The second thing I think is really important is education. You want to empower people very quickly and start educating them on the technology, its uses, its risks and the like. So start building some of these capabilities. I guess what the comment saying is not AI is not going to replace people. It's people that know or no AI going to replace people. It's only, I think, partially true. I think AI will replace people. I hate to say it, but it's probably the truth. I do, on the other hand, also believe that certain roles will go away, but the other component is there will be a lot of new opportunities coming up. So part of the training is not only training you to use AI in your current role, is how are we retraining people to potentially take on different roles in the organization when we don't need so much of the arms and legs. A big challenge that I keep hearing is, hey, we're going to get these graduates coming out of university. By the way, the AI is really good at doing what these graduates do because it's oftentimes somewhat clear. How the heck do I turn this really smart graduate into a manager if they never get to do the doing? Which
Yeah,
I hate to say it is how I learned and how most people in my generation got to learn what we know is we
yeah.
did it and did it and did it. And we got better and then we started reviewing it. And so that's a really, really good one. But again, how do you build those? I think those are some really, so that's really a component of training. when it comes down to society, the ESG frameworks are really good frameworks to evaluate, what are you doing to the organization and what are you doing, sorry, what are you doing to the community at large. My hope is that we see people similarly apply generative AI and using some of these considerations, such as what is the environmental impact, right? What is the impact on the community? And the community doesn't necessarily mean the place where you live per se, or the organization is, but the community of people, your ecosystem at large, right? Do I have a whole bunch of partner firms and companies that rely on me or partner with me? And then when I bring generative AI, am I basically destroying their businesses? And how do we collaborate with those? And, we're one of those organizations. A lot of this generative AI is going to change how we operate as consultants. And it's great to find some of these technology partners that are not just, yeah, we're going to build this technology and look to torpedo you. We're going to go straight to your customers and tell them they don't need you. They're working with us to say, hey, you know what? How do we combine these things together? How do we offer a technology-driven service so that we build a community here rather than necessarily destroy one business in the face of the other? So there was the community, it was the people. What was the third? I think there was a third one.
Society.
Society at large. Goodness gracious. Right now it's not a crazy. I think AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, will be much bigger risks to the broader society at large, because right now we're seeing these things as incremental. And the reality is, I think it was a university professor from MIT that said that technology changes quickly, organizations change slowly. So I do think that there is some time before we see these things creep very rapidly across the organizations and start having the societal impacts. But I do think that there's some real great positives, right? AI is going to help with medical treatment and education. It has a great opportunity to level the playing field. So many people that come from economic backgrounds that could not access information before, it's now at their fingertips. So there's some phenomenal benefits. There's also this flip side, which worries me a little bit, is there's a real risk of continued concentration of wealth, right? All this power right now is sitting with really 4 organizations, right? You can, I guess, add Amazon into the mix right now. So there's a real risk of the concentration of power. I think some of these are going to be ones that we all as society need to be diligent about and be thoughtful about. I think some of them are going to have to be ones where we hopefully get some degree of regulation. Although, gosh, I'm both excited about getting some regulations to avoid these big impacts. I have absolutely no idea what it would look like, because how do you do that? Creating a piece of regulation for something we don't exactly know how it's going to work without necessarily destroying the upside of it. So the society one, it's a great question. They're both, I'm a proponent, but that piece still worries me. We saw it with social media. I don't think we understood what we were doing when we rolled it out. It has amazing benefits and some bloody awful side effects. I think generative AI is going to move quickly. It'll have even some greater benefits. Unfortunately, I worry that the negative side effects are probably just as proportionate, but not to be too depressing.
No, I get it. Look, I tell it, I'm an executive coach, Jason, and one of the things that's come up quite frequently, and you mentioned about the youngsters coming out of school into the workforce. One thing that's coming out, quite a lot now, and a lot of discussion around is you'll have artificial intelligence, but you need human intelligence as well.
Yes. Yep.
You need empathy, you need compassion, you need interconnectedness and relatability, all that kind of good stuff. What's your perspective for the youngsters listening? What's your perspective as to the meta skills of the 21st century and beyond? What would you say they need to start to develop and hone in on?
Yeah, it's a great one. I think one of them is getting more exposure to technology and how it works. I do think we kind of the past several decades since technology really rolled out, we've always had IT and then the functions. And the functions use systems, but they don't really understand systems. And they may understand their system a little bit more. What I'm talking about is really understanding technology landscapes, understanding how applications work, understanding how data and data infrastructure and those tools, understanding automation platforms and how systems connect and speak to each other, and how generative AI also operates. I think it is really important for people coming into the world to be comfortable that I am a functional expert, but I actually understand this technology landscape, because I think we are in a world where technology has become more and more accessible to us as users, rather than necessarily I have to send a request to IT. How you succeed is in being really good at both. I'm a marketing person with that human intelligence, but I also understand how to use all these products to their best extent. And that's actually a huge advantage on the other end that new folks coming out have. us kind of maybe older in our careers, we were trained in a certain way, right? Where that's somebody else's, and you had to be really deliberate to get into that space. But now most of the folks coming out of college are getting trained in the functional and technology. Double down on that, become a technology expert in the functional space. I think another one is just, which I think they also have an advantage on, especially folks coming out of college, is plan for ongoing change. I remember my mom will probably hate me for sharing this, but I remember teaching my mom how to use a mouse on a computer because she was so used to tabbing. You remember good old tabbing days when you go through and navigate through a screen through the tab? Yeah, right. So, and teaching her how to use a mouse, and it was just such a foreign thing. And then there wasn't much of an evolution, and there was, it's all these it's like decades or years between meaningful evolution. I think, fortunately, our younger folks nowadays are used to some of that, but bring that with you, sustain that, be prepared, be flexible, be dynamic, right? Continues to look for a way to improve. Obviously, we don't want to reinvest hundreds of millions of dollars into technology every year, but continue to evolve and looking at good ways could be a really good way to stay ahead. So to me, that continual evolution, that combination of techno and functional skills will be a really good one. And then the one thing that really worries me about the folks coming kind of, I guess, on the younger generation is relationships and live communications. I think the power of relationships is going to be magnified in this world of AI, where we can sit in front of a computer and do so much. But the world is built on relationships, whether it's you're trying to sell, you're trying to deliver, you're dealing with conflict, whatever it is that you're trying to do is built on relationships. So it's something that, funny enough, I don't know if we necessarily train people coming out of college to how to build a network and how to actually relate to person, how to understand and ask good questions that encourage you to hear the person on the other side. So those are probably the top 3 skills I would probably encourage them to do.
I think you've got a multi-million-dollar business. Quit
Seriously.
AI and just go figure out how you teach the youngsters.
Like, actually talk to someone. Don't text him. No, no texting. No texting allowed. Put your phone away at lunch.
Funny. Okay. One of the other domains here was transparency, accountability,
Yes.
continuous improvement. So talk a little bit about the importance of accountability mechanisms in managing Gen AI risks, and who should be accountable to the decisions made by AI systems.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I don't exactly know when this happened, but I often get the impression that people I got a piece of software, so it's no longer my problem.
Yeah.
Uh, One is we've never delegated the decision making to a piece of technology, decision making, calculations, math, whatever it is. We are always responsible for it. I think it becomes more prevalent in this AI world where it truly is making decisions, or at least the appearance of decisions. Organizations own decisions within there, and that means people within, on the kind of the front lines to your boss, to the boss's boss, the CFO and the CEO ultimately are responsible for that. We will see it, no doubt. People are going to blame AI shortly about, oh, it did it wrong, and they're going to try sue the companies. But at the end of the day, I mean, any governance framework will tell you that an organization is responsible for how they operate, and that's true for a company. It's also true for us as individuals.
Yeah.
So we need to be responsible for our own actions. It doesn't matter, right? If AI says, hey, it's totally safe, please jump off this cliff, I suggest you don't listen to them, right? It's our decision. We're the one that land at the bottom of the cliff, right? So I do think it's really up to us to make sure that we do that, we sustain those and put the right type of procedures in place to reinforce. Part of it is at a policy level. Hey, the policy needs to clearly state you are responsible for the outcome generated from any AI. Most of the AI tools, by the way, will have that kind of text and kind of a light gray that you could barely see, but it's there. But then I think as individuals also need to be diligently and aware. There was the funny legal cases, right? Probably heard one in Southern California where the judge was the person to identify the fact that this was totally made up because the associate just pulled it and didn't review it, and I don't know, the lead counsel didn't check it and they just threw it ahead. Well, the individual should have checked themselves, but so should them. I mean, you should ask the questions. And I think, by the way, that's a good question for people to be asking nowadays as a manager or as a leader. When you get something, it's probably good to ask how much of this was AI generated and did you check the outcomes, right? Don't just, because it's unbelievable how people will just trust the system because the system did it, it must be right. And systems are fallible. They've been fallible for a long time. I think, what was it, somebody that told one guy that I work with, he said, it's the funniest thing. Since AI has come out, suddenly everybody believes that systems actually do work. Before, everybody would just assume that they would come out, some often make mistakes. And now GenAI, it's like magic. The irony is it's actually a technology that makes mistakes. But anyway, so you are responsible. You are, as a leader organization, responsible for your people. The AI technology is a phenomenal tool. It takes zero responsibility. It needs to stay with us.
And in our fast-paced world we live in, that is a great question, Jason. It's simple, it's foundational, but it's a great question. How accurate it is and how much of this was generated by AI. Great question. I love that. All right, governance goals. What strategies can organizations use to secure stakeholder engagement and build trust when rolling out AI initiatives?
That's a great question. And that's the thing, that early engagement is super important, making people feel like they're part of it across the board, right? If this is thing done in silos, if, we, as humans, we never like something done to us. We want something done with us.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important part of, if you want to establish trust, even if it's going to impact people's roles and jobs, and some people maybe let go and some people roles may change, it is so much easier, and organizations are so much more receptive to it. When I was at least part of it and I saw this coming and I had the opportunity to influence it. Nobody wants to be the person on the negative impact side, but at least it feels like we're engaged. I think, to me, and this is some of the things we've done, we wrote up a strategy, and then I did a roadshow for the entire company, went to every one of our offices, and I was there live, and I wanted to speak about it and hear the concerns and not pretend. And I think that's the key piece. Do not pretend. I'm not a big fan of pretending that everything's going to be all right. I think it's really important that we recognize, one, things are going to change. Some of them we know, X, Y, and Z. Some of them we don't. And we will have to adapt, and we have to monitor, and we'll communicate as we go. But I think actually people appreciate, at least my experience is, people appreciate the transparency. Leaders are fallible. People know that we're fallible. We don't have to pretend to have all the answers. You don't want to create that environment of entire uncertainty, like, oh, we don't know anything and everything's falling apart, but but recognizing, hey, there are things that we do, and we are going to control them, we're going to act upon them. These are some of the unknowns that we're going to monitor, and we're going to, of course, correct. So define the strategy and the vision, communicate it, then engage people, create many forums. We have Slack channels where we share information on literally 2-3 times a week. We have regular touch points where we do regular trainings with folks. We have an open door policy. If you have ideas, suggestions, please reach out. We have an AI team that works with me, which is made up of a lot of folks in the organization, and we are regularly cycling people through. It's a great way for people to feel like they plugged in, and then we put tools in the people's hand and regularly share. So it's just a matter of, how do we continuously do this, make sure that people feel engaged, involved. So far, at least, the reception at Connor Group has been great, which has been a real pleasure. And I think those are some of the great ways to get people involved. And by the way, we look at it as an organizational initiative. It's not I come from the delivery and consulting side of the house, but we have operational teams, HR teams, IT teams. It's collaborating closely together. So although strictly speaking, it's my purview, I work very closely with the CIO, and he and I view it as we are joined at the hip in the deployment of this technology. It's not only about getting it out there, but how do we do it effectively? How do we do it controlled? So that type of organizational view, that methodology, that having a clear organizational strategy, communication, and engaging people are great ways to get people on board with AI.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're in the final stretch, Jason, and this is a conversation around governance and risk. So what emerging risks in the AI landscape concern you the most?
I will say that data is probably still my biggest concern. It feels to me like we've seen so many data breaches and so many inappropriate use of people's data on an ongoing basis, even with traditional technologies. We've also seen some inappropriate, I'm going to call them out here, but LinkedIn, for example, I don't know if you noticed this, but I'm probably seen it by now. I mean, the fact that they just went on and said, oh, we're just going to use your data to train our models. And then they clicked the option on, and it's, by the way, hidden in several menus, was an entirely inappropriate use of data. But that, to be honest, I mean, that's a bit innocuous. It's not like they stole my personal data and committed fraud, but I do worry about that data side. That is one where it's like, you know what, it's my information. I put it out here, but I wasn't letting you use it in that way. But then there's the other extreme. I think we're going to see an enormous amount of data breaches, or people getting access to incorrect data. Could be within organizations where Suddenly everybody sees the financial data or sees people's compensation. I think we're going to see, unfortunately, a few of those major events. And there may be ones that are quiet within an organization, but there may be ones that are really big in public before I think we see people take it truly seriously. I think people say it a lot. I don't think they take it seriously enough. So to me, I think that is probably one of the biggest risks that I see. I think the other thing that I worry a little bit about, or quite a bit about, is when we implement technology in the current world, it's the technology between points of change is static. In other words, current methodology for evaluating getting technology working correctly is I do a very thorough evaluation process, has my requirements, security needs, whatever. I then get to my deployment stage and I test it then. And then I only ever touch it and test it again when I deliberately change it. Now, these generative AI tools are, yes, there's aspects of software that is static, but there's also an AI model sitting underneath these. These AI models are being evolved and changed, sometimes by the nature of just their training, and sometimes by, OpenAI's 4.0 model has not been static since they rolled it out. They've made changes to that model. The model itself has made changes to itself. So how do you know that it continues to now operate? In other words, what is the process between the deliberate change points now? Because you do have an evolutionary technology, right? It's not one where I change and then I test it and change again. I change it and I should test it. And then I need something to keep an eye that it didn't change by itself during, and then I need to change it again. So that to me is another piece where I don't think people have necessarily thought about it. And it's not just an accuracy question. It goes back to your ethics and your bias. If I have ethics and bias risk and I tested a deployment and it's not a problem, it doesn't mean that it didn't become a problem 2-3 days later when the model evolved, or a week later, or a month later. So what does it look like? How do I deal with that evolution? So I think that's where another one of those things that worries me a little bit is people like, I tested it, it's good to go. And then they just run. And they're not really thinking about because of this evolutionary nature of this technology, is how do I monitor to some extent on a regular or recurring basis?
That is a brilliant point. I hadn't even thought about that, Jason. What a great point. That's a lot. I mean, then now there really has got to be monitoring and
Yeah.
management testing and all that stuff. Wow, that's a brilliant point. I love that. Okay, let's go 1,000 feet. Top 3 questions that boards should be asking around AI governance.
Yeah,
Generative AI governance. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one they probably should be asking around, how does generative AI help our organization? Not what generative AI we're using, how does it help our organization? Because it's always, when we started, we just mentioned this, go back to the goals of the organization. It's all about what are we trying to achieve as an organization, whether those are financial goals or societal goals. It could be, medical, whatever it might be, healthcare goals, whatever it is that the organization is trying to achieve. To me, question number one is, how is generative AI going to support us in achieving those goals? So we're always refocusing on that. I think the other things that I'd probably want to ask as a board is, how is it already being used? And that worries me a lot, because there was a study that said, I think maybe several months ago, that 70% of knowledge workers are using the kind of bring your own AI.
Yeah.
They're bringing their own AI. So how is it already being used in organizations? And that's not a question of what technology did we implement. It's a question of what are people using within the organization, right? And what are they thinking and planning about using? Again, because I do think this technology is kind of a bit of a cat out of the bag type of thing. It's everybody bought this bag of cats, I guess, and then they threw it out and opened it. So how does it help us? What is going on? And then the other item that I'd probably ask as a board is, from a governance perspective, is what are those 1 or 2, maybe 3 big risks that'll impact our organization's ability to achieve its goals if we deploy AI? Where are those major risk areas? And that could be AI, if deployed with our customers, could absolutely damage the relationship. It could be a brand one, which, hey, the deployment of AI can seriously damage our brand. I think what LinkedIn did nothing to help their brand. I think it damaged their brand. There was a lot of negative publicity about it, and it was entirely unnecessary, because I mean, it's the irony of a social media network doing it is they know how quickly stories get around. As soon as somebody found it, told everybody, and what does everybody do? They go into LinkedIn and they switch it off. But it did nothing for their brand, and it's probably not getting them much more data. So it could be business oriented, customer oriented, reputational oriented, or even it's people, right? Or it's supply chain, or it's network. So I do think so I'd ask alignment of goals. What are we exactly doing today, and who and how is it being used? And what are those 2 or 3 major risks that are going to be kind of foundationally impacting our organization that relate to generative AI? And that way you're really starting with those, okay, if there's 2 of these 3 things that we need to watch for, further deployment of generative AI absolutely always needs to come back to those 2 or 3 things to make sure that we either avoid them or mitigate them as we deploy.
The beauty of zooming out, Jason. Fabulous, simple but profound questions. I love those. I love those. Well done. Thank you. All
Sure.
right. What should I have asked about generative AI that I didn't? One, I
Uh,
think we've covered a lot of ground here,
I know,
but
I know.
what should I have asked?
Maybe one question is just why it was a question that came up a lot as we were writing the framework, and even we spoke to people is why do I need a new framework? We've got lots of frameworks. We're good to go. To me, I think that's maybe just one question we can touch on very briefly. I think we've touched on these a few things already, but I think it's worthwhile kind of summarizing it. Generative AI in its nature is both, it's kind of this combination of both software as we know it and humans almost mushed together. There are aspects of programming, but there's also aspect of that human black box, which we are. I mean, effectively, we make decisions, we can explain it, but you can't really see the neural activity going on in my brain. So that's why do you need a framework? Because this is a different form of technology. It introduces new types of risk, bias, and ethics are considerations that we had, but not necessarily ones that sat within the technology, right? We would be more about, hey, are we going to not ethically use the technology? Not will the technology create an ethical violation? So being aware of these type of new ways the technology works, the fact that it has data that you don't understand, the fact that it makes decisions and make mistakes are really, really important. The fact that it is evolving all the time, that's the reason why it's so important that whether you're doing the standalone, the Gen AI governance deployment, or whether you're saying, hey, I've already got, my hope is a lot of organizations, especially large ones, have a risk management framework in place. How do I bring in some of these key components? Because my current frameworks just simply do not address these new technology risks.
Wonderful. All right, last question. Let's make this a big one, Jason. I mean, look, we talk a bit about governance. Mostly it's about the hype. I've mentioned to you, throughout my research and networking functions, etc. So, as a catalyst of change, Jason, and this is brilliant, by the way, super, super, super session. Jason, what would be your parting wisdom bite to the audience around generative AI and the governance around that?
It's a piece of advice I give to most folks, even when I do just whether it's innovation conversations or governance ones, right? Let me make sure I get the text right. It's um, think big, be practical, plan for change, right? I think it's about having a vision for the long term of where you're trying to go, but deploy it in practical steps. It's not about jumping to the vision. It's about what are the steps that we need to do to achieve that, but at the same time, be flexible, right? This thing is going to change. There's a lot that we don't know. And that's very true even for governance. What are we trying to achieve from a governance standpoint? What are the risks, those 3 risks that I'm most concerned about? What are we trying to achieve as an organization? Let's put some practical steps in place as we deploy it. Start with a policy, do some training, engage users, some practical steps, then plan for change. New laws are going to come out, new technology is going to come out. The way we use the technology is going to evolve. As that comes out, realign the actions that you're taking in the plan. So those are the piece of advice that I often use. So think big, be practical, plan for change.
Jason, this has been superb, man. Thank you so much. You are an absolute thought leader. This has been generative AI in a box. I'm nowhere, close to kind of understanding all this stuff, but this has been superb. Great wisdom bites. We've cut a lot of ground, and thank you. Thank you for all you're doing. I think this is critically important. I love the framework. We're going to post a little link to access that. I hope people kind of call you and use your expertise because this has been superb. Well done. Well
Well,
done.
thank you. My
Thank you.
pleasure. My pleasure. It's just want to make sure we educate. I mean, obviously, we're hoping to make some new connections and get to meet new people. But a big part of the framework and why we made it free is because of the fact that this needs to get out there, because we need to deploy this amazing technology responsibly, so that we get as much of the upside and as little of the downside as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you for everything you're doing to elevate humanity, because this has got social consequences as well.
It
So
seriously
thank you
does.
for that.
Absolutely.
Sincerely.
My
All the
pleasure.
very best to you, Jason.
Yeah, cheers.
Thank you.